On November 3rd, 1903, the residents of Panama City woke up to the sound of church bells ringing. At first, they thought it was a religious holiday, but as they walked into the streets, they saw something extraordinary. Men were waving a new flag, a flag that had never existed before. It was white with red and blue squares and stars. It was the flag of the Republic of Panama. The province of Panama had declared independence from Colombia. The revolution, if you can call it that, had lasted exactly 3 hours. Not a single shot had been fired in anger. The Colombian army, which should have crushed the rebellion within hours, never arrived. And 2 weeks later, the government of this newborn nation, barely able to stand on its own legs, signed a treaty handing over a 10-mile-wide strip of its territory to the United States in perpetuity. This was not a revolution. This was a corporate acquisition disguised as a liberation. This is the story of how a canal was stolen before it was even built. It is the story of how the United States realized that if you cannot buy what you want, and you cannot negotiate for what you want, you simply create a new country that will give you what you want. It is a masterclass in imperial efficiency. No messy occupation, no prolonged war. Just a checkbook, a gunboat, and a flag stitched together in a New York hotel room. To understand how the United States came to own the Panama Canal, you have to start not in Panama, but in Paris. In 1879, a Frenchman named Ferdinand de Lesseps stood before a hall of cheering investors and announced that he would build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. Lesseps was not just any engineer. He was the man who had built the Suez Canal in Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Suez had been a triumph. It had made Lesseps a celebrity. He was hailed as the greatest engineer of the 19th century, and now he promised to do it again. He would cut a path across Central America, connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific. It would be, he declared, easier than Suez. He was catastrophically wrong. The Suez Canal had been dug through flat desert. Panama was a jungle hell. It rained constantly. The heat was suffocating. The rivers flooded. And worst of all, the jungle was infested with mosquitoes that carried yellow fever and malaria. The French engineers arrived with their blueprints and their confidence. They began digging, and they began dying. Yellow fever swept through the workers' camps like wildfire. The hospitals overflowed. The graveyards filled faster than the canal. Workers would go to sleep healthy and wake up with a fever. Within days, they were dead, their bodies turning yellow as their organs failed. The French tried everything. They elevated the legs of hospital beds by placing them in cups of water, thinking it would stop the disease from climbing up. It didn't. They had no idea that the mosquitoes were breeding in those very cups. For 8 years, the French dug and buried their dead. They spent over $287 million, an astronomical sum for the time. They moved millions of cubic meters of dirt, but the canal was nowhere near completion. The company ran out of money. In 1889, the French Panama Canal Company declared bankruptcy. It was one of the greatest financial scandals in French history. Thousands of small investors lost their life savings. Lesseps, the hero of Suez, died in disgrace. But the machinery, the excavations, the incomplete cuts through the jungle, they remained. The assets of the failed company were taken over by a new entity, the new Panama Canal Company. This company had no intention of actually building a canal. They were a holding company. They existed for one purpose, to sell the rights and the equipment to someone who could finish the job. They needed a buyer, and they found one in Washington. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States was emerging as a global power. It had just won the Spanish-American War, seizing the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. The American Navy was growing, but there was a strategic problem. If the U.S. wanted to move its fleet from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the ships had to sail all the way around the southern tip of South America, a voyage of over 12,000 miles that took months. During the Spanish-American War, the battleship USS Oregon had to make this journey, and it took 67 days to reach the Caribbean from San Francisco. Naval planners realized that in a two-ocean war, this was unacceptable. America needed a shortcut. President Theodore Roosevelt was obsessed with the idea of a canal. He saw it not just as a commercial project, but as a matter of national survival. He wanted it built, and he wanted it under American control. But there was a problem. Panama was not an independent country. It was a province of Colombia, and Colombia owned the rights to any canal built across its territory. So, Roosevelt's Secretary of State, John Hay, opened negotiations with the Colombian government. In January 1903, they signed the Hay-Herran Treaty. Under the terms, the United States would pay Colombia $10 million up front and $250,000 per year in rent. In exchange, the U.S. would get a 99-year lease on a strip of land across Panama to build and operate the canal. The treaty was sent to the Colombian Senate for ratification, and in August 1903, the Colombian Senate voted it down. They rejected it unanimously. The reasons were complex. Some senators felt the payment was insultingly low, some resented the loss of sovereignty, some knew that the French company's concession was about to expire, and if Colombia just waited, they could renegotiate for far more money. It was a rational calculation, but it was a decision that would destroy them. When Theodore Roosevelt heard that Colombia had rejected the treaty, he exploded in rage. He called the Colombian government inefficient bandits and foolish corruptionists. He complained that dealing with Colombia was like dealing with a corrupt pithecoid community. In private letters, he fumed that he would not allow a bunch of Dagos to hold up the progress of civilization. Roosevelt made a decision. If Colombia would not give him the canal, he would find someone who would. And if that someone didn't exist yet, he would create them. This is where the conspiracy begins. In the summer of 1903, a Frenchman named Felipe Bunau-Varilla arrived in Washington. Bunau-Varilla was an engineer who had worked on the original French canal project. More importantly, he was a major shareholder in the new Panama Canal Company. If the United States built a canal through Panama, his company would be paid handsomely for its assets. If the U.S. decided to build through Nicaragua instead, his shares would be worthless. He had a fortune to gain or lose based on Roosevelt's decision. Bunau-Varilla was not a diplomat. He had no official position, but he was a man with a plan and a talent for intrigue. Bunau-Varilla began meeting with key figures in the Roosevelt administration. He met with Secretary of State John Hay. He met with powerful senators. He whispered in their ears. He told them that the people of Panama were frustrated with Bogota. He suggested that if Panama were to declare independence, it would immediately sign a canal treaty with the United States. He was planting seeds, but he didn't stop there. Bunau-Varilla traveled to Panama and met with a group of local elites who were also frustrated with Colombia. Panama had long felt neglected by Bogota. The central government taxed them heavily but provided little in return. The infrastructure was poor. The promises were empty. Bunau-Varilla told the Panamanian conspirators that if they declared independence, the United States would support them. He told them not to worry about the Colombian army. He told them the U.S. Navy would ensure their success. The Panamanians were skeptical. They asked for proof. Bunau-Varilla couldn't give them an official document because officially the United States was not involved. But he gave them something better. He gave them a date. He told them to launch the revolution on November 3rd, 1903. He told them the American warships would be there, and he was right. On November 2nd, 1903, the USS Nashville, an American gunboat, steamed into Colon Harbor on the Atlantic side of Panama. The timing was extraordinary. The ship arrived one day before a revolution that had not yet happened. The official explanation from Washington was that the Nashville was there to protect American citizens and the Panama Railway, which was American-owned. The United States had a treaty with Colombia dating back to 1846 that allowed the U.S. to intervene to keep the railway open. Roosevelt would use this old treaty as legal cover for what was about to happen. On the morning of November 3rd, the revolution began. A small group of Panamanian conspirators, including a fire brigade commander and several local politicians, declared independence in Panama City. They arrested the Colombian governor and a few officials. There was no battle. There was no bloodshed. It was a ceremonial coup. But the real test would come when the Colombian government sent troops to crush the rebellion. And Colombia did send troops. A battalion of about 500 Colombian soldiers arrived by ship in Colon, on the other side of the isthmus from Panama City. If those troops reached the capital, the revolution would be over in an hour. But they never reached the capital. The commander of the USS Nashville received orders from Washington. Those orders, sent via telegram, instructed him to prevent any armed force, either government or insurgent, from crossing the isthmus. When the Colombian troops tried to board the train to Panama City, American sailors blocked them. The American commander informed the Colombian officers that no troops would be allowed to travel on the railway. The Colombians protested. They argued that Panama was Colombian territory and they had every right to suppress a rebellion. The American commander was polite but firm. He said he was acting under orders to keep the peace and protect American property. The Colombian battalion commander, realizing he was outgunned and outnumbered by the American sailors, made the decision to withdraw. The troops boarded their ships and sailed back to Colombia. The revolution was over before it started, preserved by the guns of the USS Nashville. Panama's independence had been won not by Panamanian fighters, but by the United States Navy. The new Panamanian government was a puppet, and everyone knew it. But the theater had to be maintained. Within hours, the United States officially recognized the independence of Panama. No other nation recognized Panama. Not France, not Britain, not even the Latin American republics. But American recognition was all that mattered. And waiting in the wings was Felipe Bunau-Varilla. The new Panamanian government, desperate and grateful, appointed Bunau-Varilla as their ambassador to the United States. Think about that. A Frenchman with no legal ties to Panama, a man who had never lived there, who spoke no Spanish, was now the official representative of the Panamanian people. It was absurd, but it was also brilliant because Varela had one job: sign the Canal Treaty as quickly as possible before anyone in Panama could read it. On November 18, 1903, just 15 days after the revolution, Varela and Secretary of State John Hay signed the Hay-Varela Treaty in Washington. The terms were extraordinary. The United States would pay Panama $10 million up front and $250,000 per year in rent. In exchange, the U.S. received not a 99-year lease, but control in perpetuity. Forever. The U.S. was granted a zone 10 miles wide across the entire isthmus. Inside that zone, the United States would have complete sovereignty. They could govern it, police it, and defend it as if it were American soil. Panama was giving away the heart of its country to a foreign power, forever, for $10 million. When the news reached Panama, the public was outraged. The Panamanian representatives, who were supposed to negotiate the treaty, were still on a ship sailing to Washington. They hadn't even arrived yet. Varela had deliberately signed the treaty before they could land, because he knew they would demand changes. The Panamanians felt betrayed, but they had no choice. If they rejected the treaty, the United States would withdraw its protection. Colombia would invade. The revolution would be crushed. So the Panamanian government, under immense pressure, ratified the treaty. They signed away their sovereignty to survive. The United States immediately paid the new Panama Canal Company $40 million for the rights and equipment. Varela and the other French shareholders made a fortune. The money that was supposed to build a French canal ended up in private pockets, and the United States got the assets for a bargain. It was one of the most profitable corporate lobbying campaigns in history, disguised as diplomacy. Construction of the canal began in 1904 under the direction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Americans learned from the French mistakes. They realized that the real enemy was not the jungle or the mountains, but the mosquitoes. A doctor named William Gorgas led a massive sanitation campaign. They drained swamps, installed screens, fumigated buildings, and eliminated breeding grounds. The mosquito population plummeted. Yellow fever and malaria were not eradicated, but they were controlled. The death rate among workers dropped dramatically. The canal became buildable. It took 10 years and cost the United States $375 million. Over 25,000 workers died during the French and American efforts combined. But on August 15, 1914, the first ship sailed through the Panama Canal. It was an engineering marvel. It shortened the sea voyage from New York to San Francisco by nearly 8,000 miles. It transformed global trade. It made the United States a two-ocean naval power overnight, and it was built on land that had been stolen through one of the most elegant acts of imperial theft in modern history. For decades, the canal operated under American control. The canal zone became a piece of America in the tropics. American families lived there. American schools, American courts, American police. The Panamanian government had no authority inside the zone. To Panamanians, it was a humiliating reminder that their country had been created as a puppet and remained one. Nationalist resentment simmered for generations. In 1964, riots broke out when Panamanian students tried to raise their flag in the canal zone alongside the American flag. U.S. troops opened fire. Dozens of Panamanians were killed. The massacre shocked the world and forced Washington to reconsider. Negotiations began. They dragged on for years. But finally, in 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed the Torrijos-Carter treaties with Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos. The treaty stipulated that the United States would gradually hand over control of the canal, with full sovereignty returning to Panama on December 31st, 1999. It was a controversial decision in the United States. Conservatives howled that Carter was giving away a vital American asset. Ronald Reagan famously said, "We bought it, we paid for it, it's ours." But Carter understood that holding onto the canal by force was no longer tenable. The world had changed. On the last day of 1999, at noon, the American flag was lowered over the canal zone for the final time. The Panamanian flag rose in its place. After 96 years, Panama finally controlled the Panama Canal. It was a moment of immense pride for the Panamanian people. But the legacy of 1903 remains. The canal that was supposed to bring prosperity to Panama had enriched everyone except Panamanians for most of a century. The revolution that created their nation had been engineered in Washington, not born from their own struggle. Panama's independence was real, but it came with an asterisk. The story of the Panama Canal is a perfect case study in how modern empires operate. The United States did not annex Panama. It did not plant the stars and stripes over Bogota. Instead, it created the conditions for a separatist movement, provided the military protection to ensure its success, and then extracted a treaty so one-sided that it might as well have been annexation. It was colonialism with a legal veneer. It was conquest by contract. Theodore Roosevelt, for his part, never hid his role. In 1911, he gave a speech at the University of California where he openly bragged about taking the canal. "I took the canal zone and let Congress debate," he declared to Cheers. "And while the debate goes on, the canal does also." He was admitting, in front of an audience, that he had bypassed the democratic process and international law to seize what he wanted. And the crowd loved him for it. Because, to many Americans, the canal was proof that their nation had arrived. It was a symbol of power, ingenuity, and the willingness to do whatever it took to win. But to Latin Americans, the Panama Canal became a symbol of something else. It became evidence that the United States, for all its talk of democracy and self-determination, would overthrow governments and carve up nations whenever it suited American interests. The Panama playbook would be repeated again and again throughout the 20th century. In Guatemala, in Iran, in Chile, in Nicaragua, the pattern was the same. Economic interests threaten, diplomacy fails, and a convenient revolution appears, backed by American money and guns. The Panama Canal is still one of the most important choke points in global trade. More than 14,000 ships pass through it every year, carrying over 6% of world commerce. The tolls generate billions of dollars in revenue for Panama. But there is a new tension. In recent years, Chinese companies have invested heavily in ports on both ends of the canal. The largest ports in Balboa and Cristobal are operated by a Hong Kong-based company. This has alarmed some in Washington, who see echoes of 1903 in reverse. The difference is that China is not stealing the canal. It is buying influence, one contract at a time. In the end, the story of how America stole the Panama Canal is a reminder that infrastructure is never just about engineering. It is about power. The nation that controls the transit routes, the highways of the sea, the canals and the straits, controls the terms of trade. And in 1903, the United States decided that it would not ask permission. It would not wait for approval. It would simply create the reality it wanted and dare the world to challenge it. The revolution that never was. The country that was born in a hotel room. The treaty that was signed by a man who wasn't even Panamanian. The canal that connected two oceans and divided a nation. This is the story of the Panama Canal. It is a story of ambition, of ruthlessness, and of the cold calculation that when you cannot buy what you need, you buy the country instead. Subscribe now and stay ahead. When history is written, you'll be one of the few who saw it coming. If you think there's something we missed or a topic you want us to cover, let's discuss it in the comments.